when a dedicated mall security guard at Westfield Mall caught sight of a frightened young girl in the arms of a tense stranger. The uneasy feeling he experienced sent chills down the spine of everyone who heard about it. What seemed like a routine day soon took a sinister turn as the pieces unraveled, revealing a dark truth, one that placed innocent lives in unimaginable danger. This was a story of betrayal, resilience, and the relentless fight for justice. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe the truth should always come to light, be sure to like and subscribe for more. Luke Ayling stood near the large, glass-paneled entrance of Westfield Mall, his gaze drifting across the halls, kiosks, and crowds moving like a slow, continuous tide. He was still getting used to the buzz of mall life, the hum of conversation, and the mechanical purr of the escalators. The glint from the polished floors occasionally caught his eye, making him squint. He pulled at the collar of his navy blue security uniform, adjusting the stiff material that still felt foreign against his neck. Despite being 31, with a short cropped head of dark hair and a sturdy build, he often felt a little awkward in official uniforms. He had been hired just a few weeks ago, after losing a previous job he had hoped would lead to a stable career. Westfield Mall, with its bright lights and cheery music, felt like a step in a new direction. Yet there was a tension in the air, one he couldn't name, lurking behind the holiday advertisements, the sense of cinnamon pretzels, and the bright sale signs plastered on every glass display. He scanned the crowd, trying to settle his vague sense of discomfort. He had no idea that this day would mark the beginning of something that would consume his every waking moment in the weeks to come. People bustled about, carrying shopping bags and glancing at their phones. Parents guided their children from one store to another, and teenagers giggled as they flocked to the food court. At first glance, it was a normal midday scene in a busy shopping center. Perhaps he was just feeling the typical new job jitters, he thought. Maybe he needed a distraction. That distraction came suddenly, in the form of a wide-eyed, pale-faced girl being ushered along by a man in a charcoal gray jacket. The jacket seemed too heavy for the mild weather, but it wasn't the clothing that caught Luke's attention. It was the way the man's hand gripped the girl's arm. The child, who couldn't have been older than 10, looked utterly terrified. Every few seconds, she glanced up at her companion, her lower lip trembling. There was something about her eyes that made Luke's stomach clench. He had seen children frightened before, lost kids, or kids throwing tantrums, but this was different. This was the kind of fear that made a child's entire body go rigid. Luke's senses went on high alert. He moved closer, weaving between a few shoppers until he had a clearer view of the duo. The man in the charcoal jacket slowed, then picked up his pace, keeping a firm hold on the girl's arm. She seemed to shrink, her thin shoulders hunched, as if trying to disappear into herself. Luke felt a surge of protective instinct. Normally, he would first approach calmly, but something in the air felt urgent. He cut across the corridor, his steps quick but measured, and caught up to them near a large storefront that displayed colorful mannequins in spring attire. "Excuse me," Luke said to the man, his security badge reflecting the overhead lights. "Is everything all right here?" The man turned, startled, and his dark eyes flashed with annoyance. Up close, Luke saw the sheen of sweat on the man's brow, despite the cool air conditioning. The grip on the girl's arm tightened. The child flinched. Luke glanced at her, meeting her gaze. She looked at him with a desperation that tied his stomach in knots. She seemed to beg him wordlessly for help. "Everything is fine," the man replied. His voice had a forced calm. "My niece and I are just doing a bit of shopping." He tried to give Luke a polite smile, but his lips barely curled. "She's shy around crowds." Luke raised his eyebrows, studying the child's expression. "Are you all right, young lady?" he asked gently, addressing the girl. He crouched down slightly to meet her eye level, hoping she would feel safe enough to speak. She stared at him, but no words came. Instead, her little hand trembled at her side. "She's just shy," the man repeated, his voice sharper this time. "She doesn't talk to strangers." Luke stood up, resisting the urge to confront him more aggressively. Maybe she was just shy. But the fear emanating from her was too powerful to dismiss. May I see some identification? Luke asked. He kept his tone level, though he could feel adrenaline coursing through him. Something was very wrong. The man's nostrils flared slightly. He dug into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn wallet. Flipping it open, he revealed a photograph and some documents that Luke couldn't fully make out under the harsh ceiling lights. The man pointed to the photo. That's me, and that's her. I'm her legal guardian. Luke examined the photograph. It was small and a bit grainy, but it did bear a resemblance. In the picture, the girl had the same dark hair, though her expression was much more relaxed than now. He tried to find any reason to doubt the authenticity of the guardianship document, but it looked official enough at first glance. The seal was there, the text mentioning custody, something about a guardianship arrangement after the death of parents. The words blurred slightly as Luke peered at them, half lost in the overhead glow. I see, Luke said. He looked at the girl again, feeling a pang of guilt that he couldn't offer more immediate help. If the man had legal documents, there was little he could do on suspicion alone. Is there a reason she seems so upset? The man exhaled, as though exhausted by the question. She had a meltdown earlier, he said. We're working through some behavioral issues. He slipped the documents back into his wallet, then stuffed the wallet into his inner pocket. I'd appreciate it if you gave us some space. We just want to do our shopping in peace. A part of Luke wanted to demand they both follow him to the security office. He wanted to question the child alone, to see if she would reveal anything. But he had no grounds. He was a mall security guard, not a police officer. He had seen the guardianship paperwork. Even if it was legitimate or not, it looked real enough to pass. And if the girl was indeed dealing with trauma from a family tragedy, then her terror might have a different explanation. After a tense pause, Luke gave them a curt nod. All right. If you need any help, please contact us at the security office. He forced a polite smile that he did not feel. Take care. Without another word, the man took the child's hand and guided her away, disappearing into the crowd. Luke watched them go, an unease gnawing at him. The little girl cast one last desperate glance over her shoulder, her expression pleading, before she vanished behind a surge of shoppers. Luke's heart pounded. The mere memory of that look would stay with him for the rest of the day and many days to come. Shortly after, Luke checked in at the security desk, a corner next to a large video monitor setup. His supervisor, Deborah, was huddled over a coffee and sorting through a stack of forms. Deborah was in her late 40s, a slender woman with graying hair pinned back in a neat bun. She had a reputation for efficiency and for her unwavering adherence to protocol. Luke thought of her as a well-meaning professional, though perhaps not the warmest person. She seldom welcomed gut feelings or hunches, preferring hard evidence in every situation. Luke approached her. Hey, Deborah, he began, still feeling the echo of alarm in his voice. I just saw something that made me really uncomfortable. Deborah looked up from her paperwork, pushing her reading glasses up the bridge of her nose. What's wrong? She asked, although her voice lacked immediate concern. I noticed a man with a young girl who looked absolutely terrified, Luke explained. He summarized the entire exchange, from the man's sweaty brow to the little girl's trembling. He mentioned the guardianship papers, though he had not had time to fully verify them. Deborah took a sip of coffee. If he had the right documents, then he's within his rights to be here. It sounds like you did what you could. Luke's mouth fell open slightly. He tried not to sound too forceful. But I feel like something was off. She looked at me like she needed help. The man was acting strangely, too. He remembered the wild look in the man's eyes and the way the girl seemed to shrink as though she wanted to vanish. Deborah sighed. I understand your concern, Luke, but we get parents and children in here all the time with complicated family dynamics. If we stopped everyone who seemed stressed or anxious, we'd have a riot on our hands. She shuffled the papers into a neat pile. If you want to file a quick incident report, I won't stop you. But from what you're telling me, there's nothing to escalate right now. Luke hesitated. He could file the report, but he knew it would probably just get lost in the shuffle. Still, It was better than nothing. "I'll write it up," he said quietly. "But could you at least ask the monitoring staff to keep an eye on them through the cameras, just in case?" Deborah took another sip of coffee and gave a small nod. "Sure. Give the operator the details, see if you can pick them up on one of the cameras. But don't expect too much. This mall is huge, and the footage might not give you the clarity you're looking for. Still, if it eases your mind, I'll help you do it." Luke thanked her, though his gratitude was dampened by a feeling of being brushed off. As he walked away, a question hammered in his mind: what if that girl was in real danger? He didn't know what to do, but ignoring it felt impossible. He made his way through the corridors to the central security hub where multiple screens showed different angles of the mall's interior. He described the man to one of the operators, a young fellow named Eli, who had short blonde hair and an ever-present grin. Together, they scanned through a few camera feeds. They saw glimpses of a man in a charcoal jacket, but each time, the angle shifted, or he slipped behind a crowd, or the feed was too grainy to make out details. Eventually, the figure vanished. The cameras couldn't track them well enough. Luke set down a quick note for his report, describing everything he observed, then handed it to Deborah on his way out. She skimmed it, nodded, and told him she would keep it on file. The unspoken message was that it wasn't worth more of her time. Luke spent the rest of his shift patrolling the upper level, scanning faces, unable to stop replaying the girl's expression in his head. He watched families together, some genuinely enjoying each other's company, others appearing tired or annoyed, but none that resembled the man and the frightened child. By the time Luke clocked out that evening, the sense of dread lingering in his stomach had only grown. He would have given anything for a hint that he was overreacting. But his gut refused to let him relax. That night, Luke tossed and turned in bed, staring at the ceiling of his small apartment. The flicker of passing headlights from outside cast fleeting shadows across the walls. He kept thinking, what if this was something far more sinister than a guardianship situation? What if that child was in the worst kind of danger, and he had let her walk away because the documents seemed in order? He recalled the man's sweaty brow, the tight hold on the girl's arm, the trembling in her body. He remembered reading warnings in various news stories about human trafficking, abductions, exploitation. He had never expected to stumble across anything so horrific in his new job as a mall guard. But evil had a way of slipping through the cracks in the most ordinary places. Luke grabbed his phone at one point, thinking of calling someone, maybe the police. But what would he say? He didn't even know the man's name. There was no proof. The guardianship document had looked valid enough. He dropped the phone onto the pillow beside him, exhaling in frustration. The next day, Luke arrived at work with a heavy sense of purpose. He resolved that if he saw anything suspicious, he would dig deeper. He wouldn't let doubt paralyze him. He started his rounds early, scanning the corridors and storefronts, nodding at other staff members, glancing at the crowds. After an hour or so, nothing had triggered his alarm. Maybe the man wouldn't return, he thought. Or maybe the child had truly been his niece, and there was some benign explanation for her terror. The uneasy feeling remained, but Luke tried to push it to the back of his mind. During his lunch break, Luke headed to the food court, grabbing a simple sandwich and sitting at one of the tables near a wide window that overlooked a parking lot. He watched cars circle for a free space. Near the entrance, mothers pushed strollers, teenagers lingered, rummaging in their backpacks. The day was bright and sunny. It felt almost too normal for something so sinister to have happened the day before. He took a bite of his sandwich, hoping the comforting routine of a meal would settle him. But as he looked around, he noticed a small group of children milling around an arcade near the corner. A man in a baseball cap stood nearby, seemingly watching them. Another adult walked up to him, and they spoke in hushed tones. Luke frowned, his memory jolting back to the day before. He couldn't hear the conversation from where he sat, so perhaps it was nothing. Yet he found himself staring a moment longer, trying to gauge if anything looked off. Eventually, the two adults left the arcade area together, the kids none the wiser. Luke tried to quell his growing paranoia. Not everyone interacting with children was a threat. He reminded himself to remain rational, or he would drive himself crazy. He was just about to finish his sandwich when a man approached his table, looking weary and a little frantic. He was of average height, maybe in his late 30s, with tousled brown hair and lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. He wore jeans and a rumpled polo shirt, and in his hand, he clutched a phone. He seemed hesitant, as if unsure if he should speak to Luke or not. "Hi," the man began quietly. "You're one of the mall's security guards, right?" Luke looked up, eyebrows raised. He set his sandwich down. "Yes, I am. Can I help you with something?" The man hesitated. "I'm sorry to bother you. My name is Brian Walker. Well, I thought maybe you could look at something for me." He held up his phone, glancing around as if worried someone might overhear. Luke gestured for him to sit down if he wanted. Brian took a seat opposite him, fiddling nervously with the phone in his hands. "What's on your phone?" Luke asked gently, feeling that now familiar prickle at the back of his neck. He recognized the look in Brian's eyes, fear mixed with desperation. Brian exhaled shakily. "I was here yesterday. My daughter was at the bookstore with her aunt, and I was just outside, waiting. I like to test out my camera from time to time, so I was filming random footage. And I saw something. I don't know what it was exactly, but it really bothered me." Luke's heartbeat quickened. He had a strange intuition that this might connect to the incident he had witnessed. "What did you see?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. Brian unlocked his phone. His hands trembled as he navigated to a video file. "I was filming the parking area. Just playing around with zooming in on the sidewalk. Then I caught this." He turned the phone so Luke could see. On the small screen, Luke saw a shaky video of the mall's rear exit. It was distant, as if Brian had zoomed in from quite far away. A few moments in, a black SUV rolled into frame and parked by the curb. The camera shook again as Brian steadied his grip. The video captured a young girl, she must have been about 11 or 12, exiting the mall doors, looking disoriented. Another figure, partially obscured by a short wall, appeared to guide her forcefully toward the SUV. The girl seemed to resist, but the person shoved her forward. Within seconds, the door to the vehicle opened, and the girl was pulled inside. The SUV sped off, disappearing from the frame. Luke's mouth went dry. The footage was grainy, and the distance made it impossible to identify faces, but the overall scene was unmistakably sinister. This wasn't the case of a child willingly entering a car. She looked like she was being forced. Oh my goodness," Luke muttered, transfixed by the few seconds of footage. The entire video was less than a minute long, but it spoke volumes. "Why didn't you go straight to the police?" Brian gave a humorless laugh. "I did," he said. "But the officer I spoke with told me they'd investigate if there was a report of a missing child matching that description. I didn't have a license plate number, and the footage is so grainy. They said they couldn't do much without more information." He rubbed his forehead, stress etched across his face. "I also tried calling the mall's main office to see if they had any internal camera footage, but no one got back to me. So I came back today, hoping to find someone who would listen." Luke felt a rush of vindication. Here was proof that something dark was happening on mall property. He swallowed hard. "Thank you for showing me," he said, scanning the area to ensure they had privacy. "Did you see any details on the SUV? Anything that might help?" Brian shook his head. "It was a dark color, black or maybe dark gray, but it looked black to me. No front license plate visible from that angle, and I couldn't see the rear plate from where I was standing. But there was something distinctive about the vehicle. It had a dent on the passenger door, like someone had slammed it into a pole. You can't really see it in the video, but I noticed it right after I stopped filming. By the time I thought to run closer and check the plate, it was gone." Luke nodded. "That might help. A dent on the passenger door." He tapped the table, feeling adrenaline surge. "I'll talk to my supervisor again and see if we can cross-reference any external camera footage near that exit. Thank you for bringing this to me, Brian." Brian looked somewhat relieved to have found a sympathetic ear. I just want to make sure no child is in danger, he said. I have a daughter myself, and seeing that girl forced into the car, I can't stop thinking about it. Luke understood exactly how he felt. He thought of the frightened girl in the charcoal jacket's grip from the day before. You did the right thing, Luke said gently. We'll figure this out together. Brian nodded, pressing his lips into a thin line. I'm not a detective, but I feel like something's really wrong here. I was hoping the mall might cooperate more. But so far, I've just been getting voicemail messages. Luke sighed, finishing his sandwich in one large bite, though his appetite had disappeared. The mall's management can be slow, he admitted. But I'll do everything I can. Let's see if we can spot that black SUV again, or see if it's been caught on camera before. They exchanged phone numbers, and Luke assured Brian he would contact him with any new developments. Brian left, looking marginally calmer, while Luke hurried to the security office. This time, he found Deborah talking to Eli. She glanced up when Luke rushed in, and a flicker of annoyance crossed her face. What is it now? She asked, though not unkindly. She'd grown used to Luke's sense of urgency, especially over the last day. Luke described the video Brian had shown him. He played it for Deborah. Her eyes narrowed as she watched. Do you have the contact information for the man who filmed this? She asked. Yes, Luke answered, handing her Brian's phone number. We need to check the exterior cameras near the rear exit. That black SUV might show up. We might see a license plate, or at least get a better angle. Deborah sighed, then nodded. All right. Let's see what we can do. She turned to Eli. Pull up the camera feeds from yesterday, from about mid-afternoon, outside that entrance. We'll check them carefully. Eli got to work, clicking through the interface that stored the mall's recorded footage for a limited number of days. Luke stood behind them, arms crossed, tension coiling in his muscles. Deborah tapped her foot impatiently, as if she resented the extra work. They scanned one camera angle after another, each showing slightly different perspectives of the parking lot and sidewalks. Eventually, they reached the time window Brian had indicated. There, Luke said, pointing at the screen. A dark SUV pulled up outside the entrance, mostly out of view due to a tall decorative planter. Figures emerged, indistinguishable from that angle, but it seemed to match the moment from Brian's recording. They watched for a minute, hoping the SUV would move into a clearer position, but it took off so quickly that the view of the license plate was obstructed by passing cars. When the feed ended, they had no more clarity than before. The partial shape of the SUV, perhaps a fleeting glimpse of the driver's sleeve, was all they could see. Deborah leaned back, frowning. This isn't enough to identify them, or even confirm exactly what happened. Did you say the child looked forced? Luke nodded. Yes, definitely. Brian's video is clearer about the child's reaction. But the footage from the mall cameras barely shows anything. It's not definitive proof. We need more. Deborah folded her arms. We can send the footage to the police if they ask for it, but so far, we only have one worried father's account and a grainy video. She glanced at Luke, her gaze softening slightly when she saw the determination in his eyes. I understand you're worried, Luke, but we have to follow protocol. If the police want the footage, they can request it. Otherwise, we don't have the authority to track down every suspicious SUV on the premises. Luke suppressed his frustration. He knew Deborah was right about procedure. Yet he couldn't help feeling that each hour that passed allowed the situation to grow darker. The words, human trafficking, whispered through his mind again. He hadn't spoken them aloud yet, but the concept had taken root in his thoughts. All right, he managed. But could you at least keep this on file with the day's incident log? Deborah nodded, scribbling a note. I'll do that. We'll stay alert for a black SUV with a dent on the passenger door. If it shows up again, we can take action. She pushed her glasses higher up her nose. Luke, I respect your dedication. But remember that we can only act within our means. I understand, he said, his voice subdued. He thanked them both, then left the office to resume his patrol. For the rest of the day, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial. Whenever he stepped outside to roam the parking lot or check the perimeter, he caught himself peering at every dark SUV he passed, looking for a dent. He found 3 black SUVs, but none with a dent on the passenger door. Each time, the driver or passenger gave him a puzzled look, and he would nod politely and move on. Luke spent the evening in a similar mental loop, running over the possibilities, thinking about that terrified girl he'd seen with the man in the charcoal jacket, and the other child being forced into the SUV. His instincts told him these incidents were connected, but proving that connection felt impossible right now. He found himself wishing he had more training in investigations, or that he could call on some higher authority who would take immediate, urgent action. But life rarely worked that way, and all he could do was remain vigilant. The following days brought more sightings, though they were subtle at first. Luke started noticing small groups of children who seemed uneasy, pairs of adults exchanging hushed words near the exit doors, and that black SUV making sporadic appearances in the outer lanes of the parking lot. He usually only caught a glimpse before it merged with traffic or disappeared around a corner. He took extensive notes, writing down license plates or partial plates from similar vehicles, but nothing concrete surfaced. He approached Deborah with each observation, and though she listened politely, she often reminded him, "If there's no direct evidence of wrongdoing, we can't force anyone to comply with an interrogation." Luke felt stifled, like he was witnessing the edges of a massive puzzle but couldn't bring the pieces together. It was nearly a week after the first incident when Luke had another unsettling encounter. He was patrolling near the mall's play area, a small corner with slides and soft climbing structures for younger kids. Shrieks of laughter and the squeaking of rubber mats filled the space. Parents lounged on nearby benches, checking their phones or chatting with each other while keeping a loose eye on their children. Luke was scanning the area as he passed when he noticed a young boy, maybe 7 or 8, speaking quietly to a man in a dark cap. The man had his back turned, but from the angle, it looked like he was trying to coax the boy away from the play area. Luke took a few careful steps closer. The boy seemed confused, glancing around as if looking for someone. The man gestured insistently, and the boy took a step forward. Luke intervened, stepping between them. "Hey there," he said in a casual tone. "Are you two all right? Are you looking for someone?" The boy looked startled by Luke's sudden presence. The man paused, cleared his throat, then turned with a tight smile. "Everything's fine," he said. "I'm just, the boy here can't find his mother, and I was offering to help." He had a rehearsed politeness in his voice that set Luke on edge. Luke crouched to address the boy. "Is that right? Are you lost, buddy?" The boy looked to the man, then back to Luke. "I can't find my mom," he mumbled. "She said she'd be right back, but I don't see her." Luke tried to appear calm. "All right. Let's not wander away from the play area. How about we stay right here, and I'll radio for some help. We can check the mall's announcements, see if your mom is looking for you." He offered the boy a reassuring smile, then looked at the man. "Thanks for your help, but I've got it from here." The man's gaze flitted from Luke to the boy, and Luke noticed a flicker of annoyance. "Of course," the man said, stepping back. "I was just worried for him." He took another backward glance, then walked away into the crowd without pressing further. Luke guided the boy to a bench and used his radio to contact another guard, who in turn made an announcement over the PA system. Within minutes, a frantic woman appeared, breathless and apologizing to her son for taking so long. She clutched him in a relieved hug, thanking Luke for his help. Luke watched them leave together, still unsettled by how quickly that strange man had tried to whisk the boy away. Was it a coincidence, or was this part of a larger pattern? As Luke resumed his patrol, he discovered Brian leaning against a railing by a smoothie stand. Brian had started visiting the mall more frequently, not entirely trusting the official channels. He nodded to Luke, then asked, "Did you see that man in the cap talking to the boy?" "I was too far to hear what was going on, but it looked weird." Luke glanced around to make sure the man had disappeared. "Yeah, it was weird," he replied. "The kid was alone, and the man said he was trying to help him find his mother." But I can't shake the feeling there was something off about that situation. Brian looked grim. I thought so too. I've been coming here more often, just observing. I know it sounds paranoid, but after what I filmed, I can't help thinking there's a network of people lurking around, looking for vulnerable kids. Luke realized he felt a strange relief that someone else shared his suspicions. I'm not sure if it's one big group or multiple individuals, he admitted. But something's definitely going on. I've seen too many odd interactions in the last few days. Brian took a deep breath. What can we do? The police don't seem motivated with the little evidence we have, and your supervisor is bound by mall policy. Luke thought for a moment, a plan slowly forming. We can keep watch ourselves, he said. I'm here every day anyway, and I have access to the security cameras and daily logs. You can come by as a concerned citizen. We'll observe, gather as much evidence as we can, and see if we can make a solid case for the authorities. If we can catch them in the act, or get something that can't be dismissed, we can push them to intervene. Brian's shoulders relaxed, and he nodded. I'm in, he said. I just want to make sure no more kids go missing. It kills me that something so awful could be happening here, right under everyone's nose. They agreed to exchange updates regularly. Brian would wander through different mall corridors, blending in, while Luke made his usual rounds. Whenever Brian saw something suspicious, he would text Luke the approximate location. Luke would check on the cameras if possible, or head there in person if he was close by. It was an unofficial operation, but Luke believed it was better than letting the pattern continue unchecked. Over the next week, the two men built a routine. Brian, sometimes accompanied by his wife or child to appear as an ordinary mallgoer, would linger near the exits, the food court, or the play area, quietly observing. Luke took more frequent breaks to review camera footage with Eli, focusing on times when Brian noted suspicious activity. They began to notice recurring faces, a tall woman with dyed red hair who would appear with different children on separate days, always looking impatient and talking on her phone, a bald man in a suit who spent an unusual amount of time pacing near the family restrooms, occasionally leading a child away by the hand, a pair of young adults, possibly in their early 20s, who wore matching jackets and hovered near the arcade. None of these individuals did anything blatantly illegal on camera, but their repeated presence near children, and the odd sense that the children didn't look fully comfortable, made Luke's skin crawl. It was during one of Luke's nightly reviews of the footage that he noticed a detail that sent a shiver down his spine. The tall woman with dyed red hair guided a boy toward a side exit. Later that same day, the same woman, wearing a different jacket and hat, brought a different girl toward another exit. If not for Luke's close attention, he might have missed that it was the same person. She was changing small details of her appearance, but not enough to fool him. The kids didn't appear hysterical or obviously abducted, but they were pliant, almost subdued. Something about their vacant eyes and lack of energy made Luke's stomach turn. He quickly saved the relevant clips and made notes of the timestamps. He showed the recordings to Deborah, who rubbed her temples in frustration. All right, that's suspicious, she acknowledged. But we don't see her physically dragging them away. And you know how sometimes neighbors or babysitters take different kids on errands. We can't assume the worst without talking to them first. If you see her, approach her politely, ask if she needs assistance. But you can't forcibly detain her unless there's a clear sign of a crime. Luke's jaw tightened. He wanted to demand more action, but Deborah's hands were tied by regulations. So, he turned back to Brian, who was equally disturbed by the footage. This is a pattern, Brian said, and the kids all look like they're either drugged or too scared to speak up. I've read about trafficking rings that groom and terrorize kids so much that they don't even try to run. Luke nodded, recalling the haunted expression of the girl in the charcoal jacket's grasp. We have to keep gathering evidence, he said. If we can prove that these children are not with legal guardians, or link them to a missing persons database, then the police will have to get involved. Eventually, Brian managed to talk to a contact of his, a friend who worked part-time at a local news station. The friend suggested that if they got concrete proof of child trafficking, The station might run a story, which could pressure law enforcement to act more decisively. But speculation alone wouldn't cut it. They needed names, license plates, or direct testimonies from victims. That was the real challenge. One day, Luke was flipping through a statewide missing persons website, scanning photos of children reported missing in recent months. He swallowed hard when he recognized one face. Emily, age 10, reported missing 2 weeks ago from a neighboring county. Her photograph showed her smiling, with a stuffed animal under one arm. The listing mentioned that she was last seen wearing a pink backpack, that she had black hair, and that she might be in the custody of a non-custodial relative or stranger. Luke's heart pounded as he remembered the wide-eyed girl from a week earlier, looking up at him with silent desperation, while the man in the charcoal jacket insisted he was her legal guardian. A surge of guilt made Luke's hands tremble. He had unknowingly allowed a missing child to walk away with her captor. "Brian," Luke said hoarsely into his phone, "I found one of them in the missing persons database. Her name is Emily. She's been missing for about 2 weeks. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Then it's confirmed," Brian replied. "This is exactly what we were afraid of. Can you tell your supervisor?" "I will," Luke said. "But first I want to gather every piece of footage we have of her and that man. If we can show Deborah that this is a missing child, she'll have to inform the police right away." They worked frantically, reviewing the day's logs, cross-referencing the times Luke had seen Emily or the man in the charcoal jacket. They only found a few fleeting shots from different angles, all of them inconclusive in proving identity beyond doubt, but Luke felt certain it was her. He printed out a copy of the missing person alert, and highlighted the identifying details, then marched straight to Deborah's office. She was at her desk, flipping through scheduling sheets. "Deborah," Luke said, breathing hard, "I need you to see this." He laid the printed alert on her desk, pointing to Emily's photo. "This is the girl I saw with the man in the charcoal jacket last week. Brian and I have been looking at security footage, and I believe we have enough to show that this is the same child." Deborah scanned the alert, her expression growing serious. She tapped the desk with one neatly trimmed nail. "You're absolutely sure it's her?" "I'm as sure as I can be," Luke replied. "Given the limited footage, her height, the hair, the approximate age, even the shape of her face, it all matches. And from the moment I saw her, I had a terrible feeling she was in trouble." Deborah stood, gathering the paper. "We have a protocol for this," she said. "I'll alert our legal department, and we'll turn over all the footage to the authorities for immediate investigation. Sit tight, Luke. You've done the right thing by bringing this forward." Luke felt relief wash over him, tempered by the knowledge that Emily might still be in grave danger. "Thank you, Deborah," he managed. "Please, let's not let the police brush this aside. A child's life is at stake." Deborah nodded, her usual detached demeanor slipping away. "I understand. I'll keep you updated." That afternoon, the local police arrived and took statements from Luke and Deborah. Luke showed them everything: the footage, the times he saw Emily, the suspicious man's behavior, and the details from the missing person listing. The officer in charge, a tall man with sharp features, listened carefully, jotting notes in a small notepad. But when Luke finished, the officer sighed, crossing his arms. "I see how this could be the missing girl," the officer said. "But the footage is grainy, and the face isn't fully clear. The documents the man presented might have been forged, but we'll need more to establish probable cause for any arrests. We appreciate you alerting us, and we'll open an investigation. But we can't just start rounding people up in the mall." Luke tried to keep his frustration in check. "With all due respect," he said, "this child could be in imminent danger. How many more are being taken under our noses? There's also footage of a black SUV forcing a child inside. Are we not going to do a full sweep or something?" The officer looked regretful. "We need a formal complaint from a legal guardian, or we need to confirm that the child is definitely Emily. We'll continue looking into it, but without a positive ID or a license plate number, it's tough. Keep your eyes open and let us know if you spot her again." He handed Luke a card. If you do, call us immediately. They left soon after, and Luke stared at the officer's business card, feeling anger and helplessness coil in his chest. He knew the system required a certain standard of evidence, but that didn't change the grim reality. Emily was missing, and no official rescue was underway. It was as though she was falling through the cracks. Brian was equally outraged when Luke called him with the update. "This is ridiculous," Brian fumed. "If we have to catch them in the act, how many more kids will disappear by then?" Luke exhaled heavily. "We'll keep watching," he said. "We'll collect every scrap of evidence we can. They can't ignore this forever." Over the next few days, Luke's world shrank to a series of anxious patrols, camera reviews, text updates with Brian, and repeated attempts to contact the detective assigned to the case, who seldom returned his messages. Each evening, Luke collapsed into bed, replaying every suspicious moment he had witnessed, fearing he was missing a crucial clue. One afternoon, Brian ran up to Luke in the corridor near a shoe store, panting. "You won't believe what I just heard," he gasped. "I was in the food court, and I overheard a couple of guys talking about a Wednesday drop at Canfield Park. They were being really quiet, but I managed to catch some of it before they noticed me." Luke's pulse pounded. "Canfield Park? That's only a few miles from here." Brian nodded. "They mentioned something about meeting a contact, exchanging merchandise. I know it sounds like I'm jumping to conclusions, but in the context of everything else we've seen, I think they're talking about trafficking kids." Luke felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. "All right," he said. "Let's assume that's exactly what it is. Did you see any of the guys?" "Yeah," Brian replied. "One was tall and wore a charcoal jacket. I only saw him from behind, but it might have been the same guy from before." Luke felt an electric shock of recognition. "Robert," he murmured, though he didn't know the man's actual name. He had to call him something. "So they're planning something for Wednesday. That's only 2 days from now." Brian looked around nervously. "We can't wait around for the police to piece this together. We should go to that park on Wednesday. Stake it out. If we see them in the act of handing off a child, we can call the cops immediately, and this time there'll be no doubt." Luke clenched his jaw, torn between the danger of vigilantism and the moral imperative to save children. "We'll have to be careful," he said. "These people might be dangerous. But we can't let them slip away." He thought for a moment. "Let's try to let the detective know about this. Even if they're slow to respond, we'll do our best to get backup." They agreed on a plan. Brian would come to the mall on Wednesday morning, eavesdrop if possible, see if he could confirm the exact time or location within the park. Luke would clock out by late afternoon and meet Brian at Canfield Park. Together, they'd keep an eye out for any suspicious activity involving children. Wednesday arrived in a haze of tension. Luke could barely concentrate on his mall duties. He scanned every corner, listening for any snippet of conversation referencing the drop. Finally, around 4 p.m., he told Deborah he wasn't feeling well and clocked out early. Deborah gave him a concerned look but let him go. He suspected she sensed something was brewing, but she also knew how powerless they were under the constraints of their job. Luke drove his worn sedan to Canfield Park. It was a sprawling green space, dotted with old oak trees, picnic tables, and a modest playground. Jogging paths wound through patches of grass, and a small pond sparkled in the distance. The day was overcast, the sky a dull gray that matched Luke's mood. He parked in a spot near a row of hedges, scanning for any black SUVs or suspicious figures. Soon, Brian pulled up in an equally unremarkable car and parked beside him. They rolled down their windows to talk. "Any idea where they might be meeting?" Luke asked quietly. Brian shook his head. "No, but the pond area is a popular spot, and so is the back parking lot where it's more secluded." They decided to split up. Brian would sit on a bench near the playground, posing as someone reading a magazine, while Luke would take a walk around the park's perimeter, casually glancing at passing cars and people. They exchanged a determined nod and set off. For nearly an hour, Luke strolled along the paths, occasionally pausing to stretch or pretend to check his phone. Families passed with strollers, couples jogged, and a few kids kicked a ball around. Everything seemed painfully normal. He kept hoping he was wrong, that no shady deal would go down. At the same time, he dreaded the possibility that they might miss it if it did. As he approached the far side of the park, he spotted a vehicle pulling into a secluded parking lot near some trees. His heart jumped. It was a dark SUV, though he couldn't be sure if it was the same one from the mall. He stepped behind a tree, waiting. Moments later, someone stepped out of the driver's seat. Luke's stomach lurched when he recognized the charcoal jacket. The man from the mall. The man who had escorted Emily away. The man he had come to think of as Robert. Luke sent a quick text to Brian. Dark SUV, far parking lot. Charcoal jacket guy here. Be careful. He saw the man circle around to the passenger side, open the door, and lean in. Luke felt a surge of panic. Was there a child inside right now? The man shut the door again, his head turning as if he was scanning the area. Luke pressed himself against the tree trunk, trying to remain unnoticed. His phone buzzed with Brian's response. On my way. The minutes ticked by, every second feeling like an eternity. Finally, another car pulled up, a sedan with tinted windows. Two figures stepped out, one tall and thin, the other shorter and stockier. They walked over to meet the man in the charcoal jacket. Luke couldn't hear what they said, but he saw them converse with tense body language. Then the tall man gestured to the SUV. The short man handed something to Robert, who briefly examined it. Luke strained his eyes and realized they were exchanging money. The short man motioned impatiently, and Robert went back to open the passenger door of the SUV. This time he coaxed out a small figure, a child, clinging desperately to Robert's hand. Luke's heart thundered in his chest. It was Emily. He recognized her from the missing person photo. She looked terrified, her hair matted and her face pale. She wore a plain, baggy hoodie that hung off her shoulders. Luke's hands balled into fists. This was a transaction, a child being exchanged for money in broad daylight. Adrenaline surged through him, but he remembered the plan. He had to stall them while Brian called the authorities. Luke quickly typed a message to Brian. They have Emily. Call police now. He saw Brian's figure approach from the far side of the parking lot, phone in hand. Luke willed himself not to charge in recklessly. If they caused the traffickers to panic, they might try to take the child and run. Or they might harm her in the chaos. He needed to be strategic. Brian tried to move closer, casually at first, as if he was just passing through. Luke decided to come around the other side, effectively surrounding the group if they tried to flee. As he emerged from behind the trees, his gaze locked on Emily's terrified face. She noticed him, and a flicker of recognition lit her eyes. He saw her lips part, though she made no sound. Is there a problem here? Luke asked loudly, stepping forward with as much confidence as he could muster. All three men turned sharply. Robert's face twisted in anger. The tall man and the short man exchanged uncertain looks. Emily shrank against Robert, gripping the sleeve of his jacket as if she had no other choice. Who are you? The tall man demanded. His voice was low, menacing. Luke took a breath, fighting the tremor in his chest. I'm with mall security, he said, deliberately leaving out that he was off duty. I've seen you around before, and we've had reports of suspicious activity involving children. Mind telling me what's going on? Robert scoffed. We're just leaving, he said. Mind your own business. He glanced at the other two men as if to say, let's get out of here. Wait, Luke said, trying to stall them. He glanced at Emily, who was trembling. That girl, she's been reported missing. She belongs with her family. The short man spoke up, his tone dripping with threat. You have no idea what you're talking about. We have all the legal paperwork. If you value your job, you'll let us go right now. Luke's heart pounded so hard it almost drowned out his thoughts. He stood his ground. I don't think so. I've seen this girl's face on a missing person bulletin. He stepped closer, carefully placing himself so that the men couldn't easily drag Emily back into the SUV. From the corner of his eye, he saw Brian coming in from the other side. They had effectively formed a pincer. But Luke worried what might happen if these traffickers panicked or turned violent. Robert's grip on Emily tightened. She whimpered softly. His voice rose in anger, directed at Luke, but loud enough for Brian to hear too. "Get out of the way," he hissed, "or you'll regret it." Luke stood firm. "Let the girl go." A tense silence descended, broken only by the distant chirping of birds and the soft rustle of leaves. Brian held up his phone, brandishing it like a warning. "The police are on their way," he said, his voice steady even though Luke could see the apprehension in his eyes. "This is over." Robert glanced at the other two men, panic flickering across his face. The tall man hissed, "We should leave now. This is too risky." The short man looked ready to bolt, but Robert's desperation flashed. He dragged Emily in front of him like a shield, his arm tied across her torso. "Nobody moves," he snarled. "We're leaving, and if you try to stop us, the kid gets hurt." Emily let out a soft cry, tears streaming down her face. Luke's entire being flooded with horror. This was the nightmare scenario. He raised his hands in a calming gesture, his voice shaking with restraint. "Easy," he said. "Just calm down. No one wants anyone to get hurt, especially not her." Brian took a cautious step forward. "Please," he said, focusing on Robert. "Think about what you're doing. Hurting her isn't going to help you. There are police on the way. You won't get far." Robert's eyes darted around, frantic. He was cornered and knew it. Yet he still clung to the possibility of escape. The tall and short men edged backward, as if they might make a run for it without Robert. Emily sobbed, her voice trembling. "Help me, please." Luke felt that plea slice into his heart. "We're here to help," he said softly. "Robert, or whatever your real name is, let's end this peacefully. You don't want to hurt a child." But Robert was beyond reason. He snarled, "Shut up," while glancing at the SUV. His mind raced, trying to figure out if he could jump in and drive off. But Luke and Brian were in the way, and the other two men looked ready to abandon him. Luke's phone buzzed, and without looking, he knew the police must be close. An eternity seemed to pass before the distant sound of sirens reached their ears, though they were quiet, almost lost in the ambient noise of the city. Robert's body went rigid. He clutched Emily tighter, causing her to whimper. The tall man whispered urgently to the short man, "This is going south. We're not going to jail for him." The two men took off running, disappearing around the edge of the parking lot toward a line of trees. Robert realized he was alone. His eyes flashed with a mixture of rage and despair. He made a motion as if to drag Emily toward the SUV, but Brian stepped into his path. "Don't do it," Brian said, his voice hard. "There's nowhere to run." Robert's face twisted. He yanked Emily backward, nearly knocking her to the ground. Luke edged around, trying to get behind Robert to keep him from fleeing. The air was thick with tension, and Emily's ragged breaths were heartbreakingly loud. At last, Robert seemed to break under the pressure. He shoved Emily forward, momentarily letting go of her, and dashed toward the driver's seat of the SUV. In that instant, Luke lunged, grabbing Emily and pulling her away to safety. Brian stepped in front of Robert, trying to block him, but Robert knocked him aside and dove into the vehicle. "Get her out of here," Luke shouted to Brian. He scooped Emily into his arms, feeling her trembling as she clung to him. Her breath came in frantic sobs. He turned his body so that Robert couldn't reach her again. The SUV's engine roared to life. Robert slammed the door, reversed wildly, then tore across the lot. In a surge of dust and gravel, he sped away, leaving Luke, Brian, and Emily behind. Luke expected the SUV to vanish, but to his relief, a pair of police vehicles arrived just in time to see it careening out of the parking lot. The police gave chase, though they could only do so at moderate speed on the narrow roads of the park. Luke found himself panting, shaking from the adrenaline. Emily clung to him, burying her face in his chest. He stroked her hair, murmuring words of comfort. "It's all right," he whispered, tears pricking his eyes. "You're safe now." Soon more officers arrived. Luke and Brian were separated as law enforcement swarmed the scene. Emily was gently taken into custody by a social worker who happened to be on call. She was so terrified that she wouldn't let go of Luke's hand at first, until a female officer gently coaxed her into a sense of safety. Luke's eyes brimmed with tears as he saw Emily taken to an ambulance to be checked for injuries. Brian stood nearby, battered but relieved, answering a flurry of questions from detectives. The scene was chaotic: sirens, swirling lights, and the thick tension of unspoken horrors. Yet overshadowing everything was the relief that Emily was no longer in Robert's grasp. Word soon reached them that the black SUV had been cornered on a nearby street. Robert was detained after a brief pursuit. Luke and Brian exchanged a glance of profound relief. They had done it, they had saved Emily. But the cost was sinking in. How many other children had already been victimized? In the ensuing days, the news that a possible trafficking ring was operating in and around the mall spread rapidly. The police investigation widened, resulting in several arrests. The tall man and the short man from the park were apprehended after a frantic search. More harrowing details emerged. The group was forging guardian documents to abduct children from busy public places. At least a dozen kids had been trafficked in recent months through that ring. In a gut-wrenching twist, investigators discovered that some of the children had nearly been taken out of the country. One victim was literally intercepted at the airport, mere hours away from being placed on a flight. The mention of a standoff at the gate turned Luke's stomach, imagining how close they had come to losing that child forever. The media latched onto the story, labeling Luke and Brian as heroes. Local stations replayed the shaky footage Brian had captured of the black SUV forcing a child inside, splicing it with security clips from the mall, and featuring interviews with frightened parents who had been unaware of the danger lurking in a place they considered safe. Luke felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention. His phone buzzed constantly with reporters seeking interviews, neighbors calling to congratulate him, and well-wishers from the community expressing gratitude. Yet he found it difficult to revel in the praise. All he could think about was Emily and the other children who had suffered unimaginable trauma. Emily, too young to fully understand why she had been taken or what the traffickers intended, was placed into foster care under a specialized program meant to help victims of trafficking. She was terrified, struggling with nightmares, and though she was physically unharmed, the psychological scars ran deep. Luke visited her alongside Brian whenever they had the chance, bringing small gifts and reassuring her that the people who hurt her were behind bars. The first time Luke saw her in the foster home, she clung to him with such desperation that he nearly broke down in tears. He sat with her for an hour, telling her about silly mall stories and random little details, anything to keep her mind off the nightmares. Meanwhile, the fallout at Westfield Mall was intense. Deborah resigned amid the backlash, citing personal reasons and the immense public scrutiny over how mall security had initially handled suspicious reports. In the public eye, questions arose about whether the mall management had turned a blind eye to the ring's activities. Lawsuits and internal investigations swirled around. Luke was cleared of any wrongdoing. On the contrary, he was hailed as the hero who had persistently pushed the issue. Still, he felt no real satisfaction in it. The knowledge of how close they had come to failing haunted him. In the weeks that followed, Luke tried to balance the media attention with his daily life. He continued working at the mall, but the atmosphere had changed. Managers were replaced, policies rewritten, and new security measures implemented. Every time he walked those polished floors, he recalled the countless children who had likely passed by under the watchful eyes of traffickers. While he appreciated that the danger had been exposed, he carried the lingering guilt of not stopping it sooner. Yet he also felt a fierce gratitude to Brian, who had not been afraid to speak up and collaborate with him. Brian, for his part, found a new calling. Inspired by the rescue operation and outraged by the prevalence of trafficking, he decided to enroll in a local police academy. "I want to do more than just film suspicious activity," he told Luke one day as they stood outside Emily's foster home. I want to be able to stop these crimes before more children are hurt. Luke supported him wholeheartedly. He knew Brian's sense of justice would serve him well in law enforcement. One crisp evening, Luke and Brian visited Emily again. She was staying with a caring foster family who specialized in helping traumatized kids. Though she remained guarded, she managed a small smile when she saw them, and she asked if she could braid Luke's hair. He laughed softly, reminding her that it was too short for braiding, but he let her try anyway. Brian joined in, joking with Emily and telling stories about his own daughter, who was close in age. After they said their goodbyes, Luke drove Brian home. They sat in the car for a moment outside Brian's house, the engine softly idling. You know, Brian said, staring at the dim porch light, if we hadn't listened to our gut, Emily wouldn't be safe right now. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. Luke nodded. Me too. But I'm just glad she's okay. He turned to Brian, a sober expression on his face. Thank you for everything. Without your footage, your willingness to put yourself at risk, this wouldn't have ended the way it did. Brian gave a small, lopsided smile. It was a team effort. And it's not really over, is it? There are more children out there, more people trying to exploit them. We can't save them all, but we did what we could here. Luke reached over and clasped Brian's shoulder. You'll make a great officer, he said. I'm certain of it. Brian exhaled, nodding. I hope so. I just want to do right by kids like Emily. They said goodnight, and Luke drove off, the heavy weight in his chest replaced by a cautious optimism. He had come to understand that genuine heroism was not a feeling of triumph, but a burden of responsibility, and sometimes heartbreak, that spurred one to act. There was no neat, happy ending. Emily would bear scars, the other rescued kids would need extensive help, and Luke himself would carry the memory of every frightened face he had seen. Yet the darkness had been dragged into the light, exposed for the world to see. And in that exposure there was a kind of justice. In the following months, the community came together to support the rescued children. Fundraisers were held, social services were improved, and local organizations began offering training sessions to teach parents and mall employees how to spot signs of trafficking or abduction. Luke participated in a few of these sessions, sharing his first-hand experience. At first, he was nervous speaking before crowds, but as he recounted how Emily's eyes had pleaded with him, he found the words flowed naturally, fueled by conviction. He remained in touch with the detective who had originally brushed off his concerns. The detective, humbled by the revelations, apologized to Luke and even asked for his assistance in an ongoing investigation. Luke cooperated willingly, giving statements and walking the detective through every detail he remembered. The ring was extensive, but each arrested member provided new leads, eventually crumbling the network. While many of the traffickers now faced charges, there was still an undercurrent of fear. Some had fled, presumably continuing their operations elsewhere. It was a sobering reminder that victory was never absolute. Despite everything, Luke found satisfaction in going to work at the mall each day, now under new management that genuinely cared about security. The staff had expanded training, better camera systems were installed, and they began thoroughly vetting suspicious individuals. The changes were not just cosmetic. Luke saw real determination in his colleagues' eyes. He no longer felt alone in his vigilance. As time passed, Emily slowly began to heal under the guidance of her foster parents and professional counselors. She started attending a local school, where she made a few friends. On weekends, Luke and Brian would drop by the foster family's home, sometimes bringing small gifts or treats. Emily's smile grew a bit stronger each time, though her eyes held a lingering shadow of past horrors. She asked Luke to show her pictures of them all once, saying she wanted to see the place that saved her. Luke scrolled through photos on his phone, explaining the silly kiosk vendors, the bigger-than-life statues in the atrium, and the fountain that kids liked to toss coins into. Emily giggled softly at some of the pictures, though there was a wistful quality to her laughter. She would never see that space as just a mall. It was also the place she had been taken. But at least she could now see it as the place where good people found her, too. One sunny afternoon, About 6 months after the rescue, Luke arrived at Emily's foster home for a visit. He found her sitting on the porch, reading a book. She looked up, closing the book gently. "Hi, Luke," she said with a shy grin. Her voice was steadier now, and she stood a little straighter. "How've you been?" Luke asked, settling onto the porch step next to her. She shrugged in that preteen way. "Okay. The nightmares aren't so bad anymore. Sometimes I'm still scared, but I'm glad you come to see me." Luke felt a surge of warmth. "I'm glad too," he said. "It's good to see you doing better." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, listening to the distant hum of a passing car. Emily fiddled with the edge of her book. "Luke?" she asked quietly. "Yeah? Do you think I'll ever be normal again? Like, not scared all the time?" Luke swallowed the lump in his throat. He wanted to promise her the world, but he knew the truth was complicated. "I think you'll find a new kind of normal," he said gently. "You went through something terrible, and it's okay to feel scared for a while. But you're safe now, and you have people who care about you. Over time, the fear will fade, and you'll feel stronger." She nodded slowly, absorbing his words. "I want to be brave," she whispered. "You are brave," Luke told her. "You survived something awful, and you're still here, healing. That's what real bravery is." Emily blinked, her eyes glistening with tears she held back. She reached out and took Luke's hand for a moment. A small gesture, but full of trust. Luke squeezed her hand gently, offering a supportive smile. Later that day, Brian arrived with big news. He had been accepted into the police academy training program, set to begin in a few weeks. Luke clapped him on the back, beaming with pride. Emily overheard, and her eyes lit up. "You're going to be a policeman?" she asked, her voice full of wonder. "Sure am," Brian said, smiling. "I want to help make sure what happened to you doesn't happen to other kids." Emily's eyes sparkled, and she gave him a hopeful grin. "That's good," she said softly. "The world needs good policemen." Luke laughed gently. "See? Even Emily approves." In that moment, Luke felt a sense of closure, albeit an imperfect one. Life would move on, shaped forever by the tragedy that had nearly swallowed Emily. The criminals responsible would face justice, some already behind bars, others awaiting trial. More children would need rescue in other places, but here, at least, a small patch of darkness had been cleared. And from that clearing rose a stronger community, a more alert mall, and a little girl given a second chance. Before leaving, Luke and Brian walked Emily to her foster family's front gate. She lingered for a moment, looking at them with gratitude and a touch of sadness. "Will you come back again soon?" she asked. Luke nodded. "Count on it. We're not going anywhere." She smiled, then turned and ran back to the porch, waving at them. Brian and Luke waved in return, tears brimming in their eyes. They walked to their cars in silence, each of them thinking about how drastically their lives had changed since the day Luke first spotted Emily clinging to that stranger in the charcoal gray jacket. What had started as a moment of suspicion had led them on a path of danger, horror, and ultimately rescue. Months later, on the day Brian was set to begin his police academy training, Luke helped him pack up a few belongings. Brian would be commuting, but he wanted to have some gear ready. As they loaded the trunk of Brian's car, Brian cleared his throat. "You know," he said, "I couldn't have done any of this without you. That first time I showed you that video on my phone, well, I was lucky to find someone who actually cared." Luke shook his head modestly. "I was just doing what anyone with common decency would do. Not everyone would have done the same," Brian pointed out gently. "But you did. And because of that, Emily's safe." He paused, eyeing Luke thoughtfully. "You ever think about joining the police yourself? You've got a knack for detective work." Luke chuckled. "I think I'll stick with mall security for a while. We've made a lot of improvements, and I want to see them through. Besides, I can't let them off the hook just yet." Brian smiled. "That's fair. Just know the offer stands if you ever change your mind." They're always looking for good people. They said their goodbyes, and Luke drove home feeling equal parts proud and nostalgic. The last year had been a whirlwind of fear, courage, heartbreak, and triumph. He thought about Emily's face, brightening each time he visited. He thought about Deborah, who had resigned in disgrace but maybe learned an important lesson about taking employees' concerns seriously. He thought about Robert and the ring of traffickers, many of whom now waited for their day in court. Justice was not instantaneous, but it was in motion. That evening, after tidying up his small apartment, Luke sat down at his computer and opened a blank document. He began writing a personal account of everything that had happened: his initial suspicion, the frustration with protocol, the partnership with Brian, the confrontation in Canfield Park, the relief of Emily's rescue, and the subsequent wave of revelations about child trafficking. He wasn't sure if he would ever publish it. Perhaps he would share it with law enforcement, or maybe it would just remain a private journal. But it felt cathartic to put the words down, to acknowledge both the terror and the hope. The story had to be told somewhere, if only for his own sense of closure. Once he finished writing, he found tears rolling down his cheeks. They were tears of grief for the pain inflicted on innocent children, tears of relief for Emily's safety, and tears of determination to remain vigilant. The truth, no matter how horrifying, had to come to light. Only then could real change happen. Luke closed his laptop, took a shaky breath, and let the night wrap around him like a soft blanket. The following day, he was back at the mall, greeting staff members who congratulated him and teased him affectionately about his newfound celebrity. Yet behind their smiles, he sensed a genuine shift in awareness. They were more observant, quicker to intervene if a child looked lost or frightened. He heard from a colleague that the mall was installing new detection software to cross-reference known missing children with real-time camera feeds. It was a small step, but an important one. Luke walked past the bookstore, recalling how Brian had first filmed that black SUV from nearby. He passed the children's play area, remembering how the suspicious man in the cap had almost lured a boy away. He noticed parents now standing closer to their kids, or holding their hands more securely. The manager of one of the toy stores waved at him, eyes shining with gratitude. It was the kind of change that was hard to measure on paper, an atmosphere of vigilance and care. He realized that, in its own way, the mall was healing too. Near the end of his shift, Luke stepped into the security office where a new supervisor sat, sorting through some documents. This new supervisor, Martin, was younger than Deborah, with a friendly, open manner. He looked up and smiled at Luke. "Hey Luke," he said. "I was just about to call you. We've had a request from local TV. They want to do a short segment on the improved security measures. They're asking if you'd be willing to speak on camera." Luke's instinct was to say no. He disliked the limelight. But then he thought of Emily. If doing a short interview could raise awareness and potentially prevent another child from being taken, it was worth the discomfort. "Sure," he said, nodding. "I'll do it." Martin beamed. "Great. You're the perfect person. We'll set it up for next week." As Luke left the office, he glanced at the array of camera feeds on the monitors. Families bustled about, kids tugged on their parents' hands, and staff went about their daily tasks. Everything looked normal. But Luke knew that normalcy was fragile, and it took good people paying attention to keep darkness at bay. Later that evening, Luke finally pulled into his apartment complex's parking lot, the sky a deep navy overhead. He paused before heading inside, leaning against his car. He looked up at the stars, recalling the final moment when he had grabbed Emily and pulled her to safety. That fleeting instant still played like a vivid memory reel in his mind. He felt the echo of her trembling body, the weight of her terror. In the hush of the night, he whispered a quiet vow, meant for the children he had saved and the many others out there who might never know his name. "I'll keep watching. I'll stay alert. You won't go unnoticed." He let the promise settle in his heart. Yes, the mall had become a battlefield where innocence was endangered and rescued. Yes, the system had nearly failed. But in the end, truth and determination had carried the day. Emily was living proof of that. And with each new dawn, Luke stood ready to challenge any threat that might lurk in the bright halls of Westfield Mall or beyond, trusting that there would always be enough courage and compassion to push back against the shadows. He walked into his apartment, locked the door behind him, and prepared for another day on the front lines. Because for Luke Ayling, and for anyone willing to open their eyes and step up, the relentless fight for justice never truly ended. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.